Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's Mortgage Minute. My name is Art Alvarez with Mortgage Works, where we have the answers and they're on the house. I have a pretty good little show here today. Got a lot of things going on in the markets and so forth. Of course, I'm paying close attention to some sporting events, of course. French Open is going on right now. That's always fun to watch. And we got the Yankees Dodgers this weekend. So we'll see how that plays out. Let's go ahead and get right into giving an update on mortgage rates in the bond market. First thing we'd like to do is show you our rate grid on our website. We keep this up, updated daily, try to give you an indication of where mortgage rates are at. And it's interesting because what you're going to see if you check our website occasionally or when you watch the show, we're still hanging in the level of mortgage rates farther in the 60s and continue to be. So there's been very little movement from last week to this week, and frankly for the last several weeks, within a relatively narrow range. So that's what's kind of interesting about that is I saw a news headline this morning looking at the financial markets, talking about how rates have soared recently, but I'll have to disagree with that. That really is a definite over-exaggeration as what's happening with mortgage rates. They have not soared significantly at all. And then we're going to pull up the 10-year bond yield chart. We do this showing you what has happened to the bond yield over the last 5 days. It goes back to last Friday to today. And it's actually, at least as of now, today, it's reasonably positive in the sense that the bond yield had been going up to close to 4.6 at one point. Now we're down to about 4.43. So you can see how end of last week it was elevated, actually about where we were, where we are now. It actually dipped a little bit Tuesday, and hey, look, Wednesday. There's that Wednesday dip that Jeff is often looking for. We actually had a little bit of that this week. And it's climbed back up, after that. And then you can see now we're down to that 4.43. So that's positive news. That keeps us well established in the mid sixes as to mortgage rates. And so I think from that perspective, we can continue to feel good about the fact that mortgage rates generally are pretty stable. And I think stability is a good thing when you're talking about the financial markets. In terms of what went on this week and in the markets, economic data points and so forth that can move yields, not a whole lot. Early this week, we had the durable goods orders that did come in lower than expected, biggest drop in 6 months. And of course, who's to blame? I saw it referred to as tariff damage. That's interesting because most of the tariffs really haven't kicked in yet. So it's interesting that something like tariffs that haven't been fully implemented are causing damage, and I think it's more about the anticipation of what tariffs may do to damage things. That's what's going on there. It's creating a little bit of uncertainty, and of course, when that happens, people will sometimes pause when they're looking at making major purchases, and then of course the manufacturers have to take that into account so they don't end up with over capacity or too much inventory actually. Case-Shiller Index, always want to bring that up when they release their latest report. Again, this is a index of home values in the U.S. It's considered sort of the benchmark in terms of tracking where home values are going. And their latest release, guess what, folks? Still up 3.4%. That's an annual number. So the Case-Shiller Index continues to support the fact that home prices have been and are still going up, but there is a but there, cooling. So the rate of increase is definitely cooling. It is stabilizing. Remember, this Case-Shiller Index in earlier months this year was in the fours, even up to the mid fours. So you can see by the fact that it's dropped into the threes, that is indicative of the fact that home prices are cooling somewhat. But in my mind, this is a good opportunity, which we'll talk about a little bit later when Jeff comes on for our discussion. Personal income, which is actually coming out tomorrow, that is forecast to be slightly lower. Again, I think tariffs will be blamed for that maybe folks are seeing their income adversely affected a little bit by service providers or manufacturers if they're pausing on their output because of waiting to see what's going to happen with tariffs in terms of what actually gets in place and we can rely on longer term. And then the other thing that's going to come out on Friday is going to be personal consumption expenditures index, or PCE. That's the Fed's favorite inflation target. It's forecast to be down, slightly down tomorrow. Year over year, it's supposed to be at forecast at 2.2% versus 2.3 the previous month. If that happens, then we have yet another inflation indicator that's pretty positive. Remember a couple of weeks ago, CPI, PPI came in, benign, flat, slightly lower than expected. If this comes in a similar fashion, that's more evidence that the inflation part of the economy seems to be getting relatively under control. And yet, like I said, there's this article I saw this morning about, it was actually about pending home sales, which I don't have on the chart here. But the pending home sales were announced to be down 6.1% in April. Now, a pending home sale is one where a contract has been accepted and the escrow has been opened. So it's considered a indicator of future home sales based on how many of those pendings actually close. So when you see a high percentage like 6.1% drop in pending home sales, that means you're seeing some transactions where there's an open escrow are canceling and not following through to closing. In fact, I heard another tidbit in terms of that particular phenomenon, where right now about 1 in 7 purchase transactions are not completing the escrow. They're falling out before the escrow closes. And of course, the blame is soaring mortgage rates is causing this drop in pending home sales. I would push back on that. Mortgage rates are not soaring. In fact, if you go back and look at the 10-year Treasury bond yield, again, that's your best barometer. You go back to last October to now, the 10-year bond yield has been in the range of about 4% to 4.75% through that entire 8-month period. And again, we just showed you we're down to 4.43. So when you look at it from that longer term perspective, mortgage rates are not soaring. They are actually relatively stable in that low to high 6 range. And again, I think that's a good thing. Stability, I think, is a good thing. I think it'll start to make people a little bit more comfortable about considering getting into the home purchase arena if you've been waiting for the right conditions to do that. So that we're going to go ahead and bring Jeff on so we can talk a little bit more about the home, whether it's a good time right now and so forth.
Hey, Art, how are you doing?
Good. How are you? Good.
So you said something about sports teams. So how are your sports teams doing?
Well, yeah, that's a question, isn't it? Of course, as I'm a baseball guy, so my team is the Angels, which, of course, about 10 days ago, looking pretty optimistic. They had won 8 in a row, and I think since then they've lost 5 in a row. So, and the Yankees are going to be in L.A. starting tomorrow, right? Well, I guess they're already in L.A. anyway because they played the Angels at the beginning of this week, and of course swept the Angels. That's part of their 5-game losing streak. So now they're going to go play with the big boys at Dodger Stadium. That's going to be a great series. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm going to root for the Yankees because, as an Angel fan, I'm jealous that the Dodgers are doing so well. And of course, they have what was our best player in the Angels. So
trades. It's players to the highest bidder, right?
Yep, exactly.
I have a question or a comment about this whole idea that you mentioned about what the headlines, and you've warned us, you've told us, hey, beware of the headlines. And that when you mentioned about the interest rates soaring, and yet you said, hey, let's go back to October, and it has almost very little movement. In fact, as I was updating the chart today, I'm like, wow, it doesn't look like they've really moved at all. And so it's like, how do you call those people out who are fabricating or stretching the truth?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure I know what the answer is. I mean, I think there's a general inclination in the media, particularly online with written articles and so forth, that of course we've talked many times, beware the headlines, clickbait, and so forth and so on. That continues to happen. In this news blurb I saw this morning about soaring rates were the culprit in the drop in pending home sales. Of course, when you get into the article, you can guess what else was pointed to as to these soaring mortgage rates. Well, they tried to make a correlation between when Trump announced his schedule of tariffs. You remember when he had that chart with by country, he had the tariff numbers. So
Yeah.
the writer was trying to draw a correlation of when that was announced, when those tariffs were announced, as a trigger to cause mortgage rates to start soaring, and like they're soaring now. But as I just pointed out, if you look at the 10-year bond yield, that's your best barometer to track the direction. You There's no way you could look at that chart from October to now and determine or conclude that mortgage rates have soared. It's just not true.
It's like, I know these people who write these articles, no matter what it is, they understand that sensationalism gets the headlines and gets our attention. And I was reminded that this morning when someone sent me something and said, "Oh, Musk is out. He's leaving Doge." And this isn't meant to be political. It was to the point of only reading the headlines. Well, the article that he shared with me never mentioned the fact that he is a special employee or a special position, and it was only supposed to last 130 days, which ends May 30th. And I'm thinking that's tomorrow, and that he was going to be gone anyway. That was his term, but they didn't mention that. It was like, oh, it's because of, he had a disagreement of this. No, it had nothing to do with that. He was by order of the president only 130 days, and that's what he is. So we have to be careful about that. And you have warned us of that time and time again.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's true, and that's why sometimes you have to spend the time to dig into the article and find out what the truth really is. And a lot of times, the truth is buried many paragraphs down from that headline that grabbed your attention. And yeah, I'd heard that too. Is that he was never signed up for a long-term position anyway. It was
No.
130 days, and the 130-day mark is tomorrow. So, of course, if that was put on the headline, nobody'd read it because it's like, we already know that. Let's move on.
Yeah,
So,
big deal.
yeah.
Well, speaking of truth, I want to kind of peel back the layers and have your help today because I think about when I was young and buying a first home, it's like, hey, it's not always easy. And it seems like we live in a world of, if it's not easy, you probably shouldn't get it. But I want to talk about, is owning your own home worth the sacrifice? And let's talk about that a little bit today.
Yeah, I think that's a very good subject to talk about. And there's a couple of issues there when we're talking about this subject. First of all, is a home worth the sacrifice? Obviously, with that question, what comes to mind almost immediately is something we've talked about before, and that is home ownership as a pathway to build wealth for you and your family. And we had talked in the past, it's been a few months ago now, the Federal Reserve every couple of years does a study on U.S. wealth creation. And when you look at least, I think one of the more recent studies, one that was actually published almost 5 years ago in 2020, that study was remarkable in its conclusion because what it pointed out was that the average median household wealth for homeowners was $255,000. The median wealth of a renter or a renter household was $6,300.
Wow. Wow.
That's a 40%. I mean, being a homeowner, the data shows that you have 40 times more wealth created versus if you were renting. And to me, that is a number that is so striking and so true. How could you not hear that and conclude, man, I need to rethink things. I need to figure out how to get into home ownership if, and it's if, I have to say if, because some people, I guess they don't care, that it doesn't matter. If you want to build wealth, you really got to take a hard look at that home ownership, stepping in and trying to buy that home. But yes, as with everything in life, there's a trade-off. So if you want to get to that much loftier, 40 times higher number that you're going to achieve as a renter, then you've got to make some sacrifices and make some hard choices to decide to go ahead and buy and pursue that pathway to much more wealth.
Well, it reminds me of that saying is, if you sacrifice now, you'll enjoy the wealth then. And it doesn't have to be 40 years from now. But if you take the easy way now, it's going to be harder down the road. And I think of what you just said is if you wake up and you've been renting for your entire life and you have a wealth of $6,300 versus someone who said, hey, back then I decided to buy a house and do whatever it took to get in a house if I can afford it and make it work. If I cut back on my lattes or only drove one car, whatever it may be, but my wealth is 40 times greater than if I would. I mean, that's just boggling my mind, Art.
Well, right. And 2 points I want to make on this. One is there's the argument that, and I've seen articles written about this, and I don't actually disagree with them. There are those who would argue you don't need to own a home to build wealth. Or in other words, home ownership does not have to be a part of wealth creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree with that. I don't disagree with that. I think that that is an accurate statement. You don't need to own a home to create wealth, and maybe as much wealth as that median homeowner that we just described worth $255,000. I agree. You don't have to own a home to get there. And the argument is always, well, if you're a renter, you're likely going to have a lesser housing expense than a homeowner. And that's a variety of factors involved that we won't get into. And so because of that, that renter has the opportunity to take that housing expense differential and apply it wisely toward financial investments and so forth, and simply build their wealth through that means rather than owning an asset like a home. Again, I don't disagree with that. That is an accurate and viable alternative. But like with everything in life, there's a but. And I think the Federal Reserve study, the most recent one I just quoted from, underscores this. If the median price, or I'm sorry, the median wealth of a renter is $6,300, that by implication means 99% of those renters aren't doing what the persons who defend renting say they can do. They're not building wealth. They're not taking those dollars, that gap in housing cost from lower rent versus owning a home. They're obviously not taking that amount and applying it, investing it to build their wealth in a different way. So that's I think a point that can't be understated. And I see this all the time. I mean, I encounter some folks who are young, they want to buy a home, they're kind of grumpy about they haven't been able to. But when I start to get to know them, because of course I have to ask a lot of questions about them financially, what I start to learn is they're very high income and they're very high spenders. And that's where you have to make some tough decisions. And I want to tell a quick story about this, because this is really not an entirely new phenomenon. I can remember in 1999, I was at a new home sales office in Paris, California, at a subdivision called Main Street. And I was there on a weekend to pre-qualify buyers to buy one of those homes. We were the preferred lender for the builder. And I met this young couple. They were in their late 20s, and they wanted to be qualified to buy one of the lots. I sat down with them, spent a great deal of time with them, asked them all the questions. I could see we were having some issues getting them qualified on debt ratio. I asked them if they could get help from a family member as a co-signer. That wasn't an option. Then I tried to see, what we can do to get their debt ratio in line based on their income. Well, what stuck out was a payment on a truck, and they drove to the sales office in this big, fancy, really nice truck. Back then, I mean, we're talking 26 years ago. Their monthly payment on that truck was almost $900 a month.
Oh my gosh!
Again, in 1999.
Wow.
So this young man had found the truck of his dreams, and he was very proud of it. And I said, look, I can get you into this home, but you have a difficult choice to make here. We need to get rid of this truck payment. And if we can, you can buy this home. So we talked a little bit about, maybe sell the home, and then buy another much less expensive car, just get some basic transportation, again, make that trade-off, make that hard choice, give up the fancy truck that you're very proud of to help you get into home ownership. You can always go back and get another one of those trucks later. So they really thought about it. They left the office for a little bit to go talk among themselves, and they came back, sat down again, and declared, no, not going to sell the truck.
Oh, geez.
And they walked away, and they didn't buy the house because I couldn't, pre-qualify them to buy. They didn't qualify because that was in the way. So that's an example of, it still goes on now, but that even would go on back then, that sometimes a family, a household isn't willing to make those tough choices. Go out to eat less often, make your dinner at home. Don't call Uber Eats for takeout, where the cost of that takeout goes up by another 25%. Take fewer vacations, because a lot of folks are younger. They want to experience life. They want to go on a lot of trips. I totally get all that. I'd love to do that too. But again, you got to make some trade-offs and maybe cut back on that a little bit, and accumulate your funds and get yourself positioned to buy, and then go back and do some of those fun things after you've accomplished getting that asset that's going to help you get on that wealth creation pathway.
Yeah, it reminds me, I hear more and more often, and again, I don't mean this in a negative, it just is what it is. We'll be spending some time with our friends that have adult children, 25 to 30 years old, and they're talking about, their son or their daughter are going to a wedding of their friends in Vietnam or in Italy. And I'm like, really? And they're doing 3 of those this year. Well, wow, that's a lot of money. Even if you take economy and stay in Airbnb, that's a lot. That's like that truck. It's those decisions you have to say, you know what? I thought you were going to tell me for sure, Art, they were going to come back and said, you know what? We've made a decision. Our home is more valuable to us. We're going to get rid of the truck. That's amazing. They would not let go of that truck.
Yeah, that has stuck with me ever since. And again, it's a fundamental, if you think about it, I'm a loan guy. I want to lend them money because I want to see them buy the home. That's how I get paid. And I kind of look at that from afar and say, well, you're not thinking clearly about this, because you're investing a lot of money in an asset, a vehicle. I mean, you almost don't want to call it an asset. Why? Because it depreciated by 30% when you drove it off the lot. Yeah. By the time you finish making the payments, it's not going to be worth anywhere near what it was when you bought it in most cases. So it's like, why would you dedicate so many of your dollars, hard-earned dollars, toward a depreciating asset rather than, make some tough decisions financially in terms of how you spend your money, get yourself positioned to acquire an asset that is leaps and bounds more likely to build wealth for you? Because as we talked about on the show just a couple of weeks ago, only 7 years out of the last 75 has the median home price dropped for the year. When you look at it that way, those are pretty good odds that owning a home is going to pay off rather than not. The 2008, that was a once every few decades kind of an environment, kind of like the Great Depression from 100 years ago, right? So
right.
You got to kind of look at it in full context and realize those hard choices are going to really pay off in the long run if you can make them and stick with them.
Well, it makes me think about your Case-Shiller index saying it was still up almost 4%, with like 3.4%.
Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, let's say, for instance, that let's go back to 1996. What kind of price range are we talking? $120,000, $150,000 home?
Yeah. I mean, the median price, of course, was much lower back then. In fact, I think the home that I was sitting down with that couple in Paris, California, I think was in the 180 range, something like that. And of course, that is a factor, obviously, in affordability and so forth. Heck, when I got in the mortgage business in 1982 January, and the rates were 17.5, well, okay, but the median home price was up $64,000.
Wow.
So somebody young, young adult this age hears that and they go, oh, they can't imagine that, but right. But yeah, that's obviously a factor. But unexpected windfall. More recently, there's a very good example of the potential windfall from getting into home ownership. If you bought a home in 2019, pre-pandemic, the median price of a home in the U.S. was $304,000, or no, $305,000. In 2024, the median price of a home in the US, $427,000.
Wow.
That's just
Wow.
in the last 5 years. And that rate of growth in 5 years, that rate of appreciation in that house is 40%. So you're talking 8 to 10% a year gain in equity, which means gain in wealth. Simply if you had, by the luck of just good timing, bought a home in 2000, maybe 18 or 19, and then see where you're at now. Of course, that's part of why we got all these homeowners with all this increased wealth, increased equity with 2.5% mortgages, because after they bought the home in 19, they refinanced it in 2021 at 2.5, and that now they're in this great shape of, I own a home where I've hit the home run in terms of creation of wealth and gain of equity, and I got the cost of the loans next to nothing, so I'm in great shape. Of course, that, as we've talked about in other shows we won't get into here, can create its own form of paralysis in terms of moving forward. If you need a bigger house, or you want to spend some money to improve your house, you got to figure out how to do that. So,
well, is it, when we talk about unexpected windfalls, you're talking about your home and the fact that it had such a great growth over that short period of time. But it's almost like saying, hey, you know what? I'm just going to invest $100 a month in my IRA. And it has a mix of funds in there. And we find out one day it was this little stock called NVIDIA, or it was, and all of a sudden it was just nothing. And then all of a sudden it was that supercomputer chip maker of the world, and it's just gone through the roof.
right.
That's an unexpected windfall because you just did the consistent things. You said, hey, I'm going to make this sacrifice. I'm going to put this money away. Isn't that kind of the same thing, Art, of saying, you know what, instead of putting it in a depreciating asset like an automobile, or even a vehicle like a rental, isn't it better to say, let me just put it in this forced savings account called a home, and let's see what happens?
Well, exactly right. I mean, it can't be more clear. And that's part of the benefit of, if you decide to make the jump from being a renter to being a homeowner, and if you're successful with that, being that homeowner, even when you get the loan, you have to get a loan to buy that home. You may start off with a relatively modest amount of equity, maybe because you didn't have much of a down payment. But one of the beauties of owning a home, particularly if you financed it, is the ability, just by covering that monthly housing expense, which ultimately is to put a roof over your head, right? But the kind of associated benefit is the forced savings that's created by paying your monthly payment. It's paying down the mortgage balance. And of course, assuming you are still seeing some appreciation in the value of the home, as Kay Schiller is now telling us 3.4% the most recent month, it's been running over 4 for the last several months. Well, what's happening there? You're basically creating forced savings. You're basically investing in an asset that isn't depreciating because you drove it off a lot. It's appreciating, at a 3 to 3.5 to 4 to 4.5% rate per year. Combine that with you're spending your housing dollars paying down a loan balance. That's the combination of that appreciation in market value and paying down that loan value. That is a great example of forced savings that's going to help build that wealth over time.
Well, before we go to this last point, I had a conversation with someone who's we both know today, and she's a young lady, 21 years old. And I told her, I said, I'm in a mastermind group, and one of the things that was brought up in our mastermind is, if you could go back and tell your 21-year-old self something that they didn't know then that you know now. And I would say, and I said, if I were to do that, I would go back and remind my 20-year-old self the value of compounding interest.
Yep.
And that's exactly what we're talking about. It's like, hey, you underestimate what that payment will do over the course of 10 or 15 years. It's just mind-boggling.
It really is. And see, if you think about it, when you're a renter and you're paying rent, you're not even exposed to that concept, right? Because those dollars are basically, yes, to provide you housing, but that's it. There's no asset involved. There's no forced savings involved. There's no wealth creation involved. So you don't, as a renter, you don't really get exposed even to the idea of compounding interest or compounding yield on that asset. And so it's to me, it's a rather obvious wasted opportunity. But again, I don't want to come off too strongly on my soapbox, like, renter bad, homeowner good. I mean, again, you can do a lot of things and accomplish a lot of things financially as a renter, but that is underscored by the fact that you have to have the discipline and the focus to achieve similar results to being a homeowner, but doing it in a different way. My argument simply is, be honest with yourself that most of you, as the data shows, simply don't do that.
Yeah. Well, this last point is something you spoke about a couple of weeks ago, and that is buying a home that's less than perfect. Talk to us about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, particularly for I think the younger home buyer, you're already struggling to find a home. You're struggling with the home prices, and of course, you think mortgage rates are too high. I think one area to focus on in terms of searching for a home, particularly if you have any talents yourself in terms of, refurbishing a home, whether it's construction related talent or more interior design type talent. If you have anything along those lines, or you have friends or family who have talents in those areas, a great way to kind of get into the home ownership arena and do so at a lesser price level and and therefore overall lesser cost is, look for something that might be a little bit older, might, cosmetically be a little bit out of date, let's say, may have that 1970s, avocado green carpet or something, but realize is that is an opportunity, because first of all, your access point in terms of the price you're going to have to pay for that home is going to be lower. And after you've looked at it, if you can find that it's primarily a cosmetic issue, there's nothing structural going on that's really going to jeopardize your overall viability of the property, that can be a great way to get in at a lower price level, maybe use a little bit of sweat equity, and then get that home refurbished over time. You can still live in it while you're working on it. And that is another great way to actually, even to some degree, accelerate the potential wealth creation if you can find that right opportunity out there in the marketplace. Get that fixer home that's still livable, but you can at a relatively modest cost. And particularly if you have some talent to do some of it yourself, that is a terrific way to get into this scenario, this strategy, and it'll really pay off for you in the long run.
Well, we were this past weekend, of course, is Memorial Day, and we were visiting some friends in Long Beach. And while we were there, their next door neighbor, a young couple, I would say they're in their mid 30s, and they had done exactly this. They had bought a smaller home next to them, and then they had totally gutted it, raised the ceiling, extended it, and increased the value by almost $500,000. But they did that for about $150,000 in renovation. Now, for them, they both are very busy career-wise, so it took them about 8 months in total. But at the end of the day, it was almost like they had created wealth out of, I don't want to say thin air, but where it didn't exist before, because they bought a home that needed to be fixed up in a very nice neighborhood, but it was the smallest one there, but it was on a really big lot. So they did what you said. They expanded on that and really turned out nice.
Well, and that's a nice story to hear, particularly if they're the type of buyer who, with that strategy, intend to actually keep the home, live in it for a longer period of time. Because of course, one would argue what you just described as something that property flippers do, right? They'll find that older home and then smallest home, the home in the neighborhood that's in the poor, lesser quality in terms of condition. Try to go after that and dress it up and flip it for a profit. So it's and there is a lot of that out there that you, as a new home buyer, if you want to buy a home to live in, you may have to compete with that. But that's a nice story, given the fact that in that case, it wasn't somebody who's just trying to flip it for a profit and make a quick buck. They were really building for the long term, for their long-term financial stability, and wealth that they're going to be able to achieve by pursuing that strategy. So that's a great story.
Yeah, they turned it into. They had an open house on Sunday, or excuse me, Saturday while we were there, and they really have turned it into their forever dream home. It's spectacular. So it was a lot of fun to see that, and because these are our friends that live next to them, we saw it in the before state, during state, and then after state. It was a lot of fun to see it now completed.
Oh, I bet, for sure.
Well, I do have something else I'd love for you to touch on, and this is, giving us kind of a bottom line, if you would.
Well, the bottom line, I would say, and again, I know this sounds like a line, and of course, when you're in real estate, you're accused all the time of suggesting that now is the right time to buy. But I think really, truly, we have the perfect combination of conditions that for a prospective buyer, you really ought to take a look at the market and see if it's the right time for you to consider trying to buy a home. And there's various reasons I say that. Mortgage rates, yes, compared to the pandemic, they're higher, but they're actually affordable, historically speaking. Rates in the sixes are better than they have been on average over the last 50 years, which that number is more like 7.7. Now, home prices have gone up quite a bit, as we just commented about, but there's a little bit of softening. Are prices falling dramatically or significantly? No, but just that little bit of cooling off is a very good opportunity, because here's what I'm hearing from realtors, at least in our local market here in Palm Springs and the greater Coachella Valley area. Realtors who are listing homes are struggling with sellers who are not coming to grips with the fact that the market is shifting. It's softening just slightly, more inventory, more days on market. Buyers have a little bit more leverage now. So the realtors who are listing homes are struggling with some sellers who are having difficulty grasping that and getting more reasonable about their asking price. At the same time, realtors who are holding open houses are complaining a little bit about there's not seeing a lot of activity from prospective home buyers. There's not a lot of prospective buyers coming through and looking at that home. That's an opportunity. If you're looking to buy a home right now, what that tells you is there's probably less people out there looking around. That gives you a better shot at that home. And given the fact that the market is shifting, home prices are growing at a slower rate, that gives you that opportunity when you're negotiating an offer and you're going to need financing to complete your purchase, to negotiate some concessions. Get a seller credit, excuse me, and sometimes a significant one, maybe 2, 3, 4% of the list price. Maybe offer full price, ask for a seller credit 2, 3, 4% of that offer price, that full list price offer. Get those concessions, that concession as dollars from the seller, apply that to your financing. I worked on one yesterday where we ended up providing them a quote based on permanently buying down the interest rate to some degree, then layering in a 2-1 buy down on top of that, and then be able to actually pay some of their closing costs, all from a seller credit that was negotiated as part of their offer. This could not be a better time to negotiate in that way as a buyer, as a first-time home buyer, for example. And then that way, if you're successful, you're going to accomplish a couple things. You're going to obtain an asset that law of averages would suggest is going to grow over time. It's going to become more valuable. You're going to have more equity as the market value goes up and as you pay down the loan. If you get a permanent and or temporary buy down, what that does is help reduces your monthly payment and your interest rate from current levels for a 2 to 3 year period on a temporary buy down, maybe for the life of the loan on a permanent buy down. But what that does, it gives you some payment relief, some rate relief. And then when mortgage rates in general fall, which is probably 2 to 3 years away to get much, significantly below the sixes, then you'll have that opportunity to refinance that note rate and have something even better long term. So with that kind of strategy, you're going to build wealth, you're going to get the housing that you need, and you're going to have that opportunity over time to see that wealth go up even more and more. So that's what I think is the opportunity in this market right now.
It seems like you're saying that it's as you say, it's shifted. It's really shifted in such a way for home buyers that it's creating some opportunities for one selection because the inventories are a little higher. The inventory is staying on market a little bit longer, and the owners, as you say, are more willing to do some things creatively as well as with your help from a finance side to really make it not such a bad time to buy.
Exactly right. More and more of the transactions that we're working on now that I'm getting requests for pre-qualification for, I would say probably more than half now are involving a negotiation where the buyer is extracting some concession from the seller. So I'm seeing that much more frequently. And I would say it's not all the time, but it's getting to be more than half the time. I'm seeing that with every new request I get. And so that's why anybody who's been on the sidelines wondering if now is the right time, I really think it is. Get into the game, try that strategy. We can help you with that. I'd be happy to do a consultation with somebody even before they start looking so that they're better equipped to go out there and kick some tires and find the right home for them.
Art, I hate leaving on bad news, but I think because we set the tone on this whole conversation is it was a bit of a truth session. Yeah. And so I want you to share what you feel like, hey, there's some bad news out there. Share that with us, if you will.
Well, I think for one, the bad news is that waiting. I think first of all, waiting can work against you. We've already seen that. Yes, right. Home prices are growing at a slower rate, but they're still growing. And so as you continue to wait on the sidelines, that's missed opportunity because you're just going to be having to start at a higher level later on if you really want to get into that wealth creation situation long term. And so, there's always the potential of something bad news in terms of economic data and so forth. There's a lot of anxiety and turmoil with the tariffs and all that. I think ultimately that's all going to play out fine. So I wouldn't get too overly anxious about thinking that the economy is too uncertain. There's all this hand wringing now about increased deficits from the big beautiful bill, and again, we still don't fully know what's going to happen with the tariffs. So all that can be kind of digested as bad news, but I think none of it is at a level that it's going to undermine or completely destroy what I think overall is the right opportunity to look to buy now and get into that home ownership and that wealth creation path. Because even if things do get a little sideways after you acquire the home, we're not going to see '08 again. So I think you're going to be in pretty good shape to weather the storm if there's any other bad news economically that hits later on the horizon. So
what do you pulling out your crystal ball, and then I'll let you go, what do you see? You said something earlier about, you thought maybe rates were probably 2 to 3 years away from seeing a significant drop or seeing a drop in the rates. So tying in a potential, 3-2-1 buy down or a permanent buy down, and then really, as you say, holding both sides of the coin, then just wait it out, because at that point, in between now and say 3 years from now, do you see our home prices, our values actually going down?
I don't, because to me, what's going to happen, recently Fannie Mae just announced an update to their interest rate forecast. And of course, the headline made it sound like Fannie Mae has predicted a, huge drop in the mortgage rate by end of the year. Well, when you read the article, they dropped the end of 2025 forecast from 6.2 to 6.1. But it was a little better, right? So the point is that rates eventually they are going to drop. But in fact, I had a conversation with somebody yesterday. Brought up when rates get to 4.5, I'm like, time out. You're probably looking at 3 to 4 years away before that happens. But see, that's where the 3-2-1 buy down, to me, if you can get those concession dollars, is a great way to set yourself up for that, because you got a 3-year window where your rate's subsidized below current market for 3 years. And if rates do eventually get to mid fives, low fives, maybe break that 5 barrier in 2.5, 3 years from now, great opportunity, refi, get rid of that 6.5 no rate. Now you're going to be at 4 7/8 for another 30 years. You're going to be in really good shape.
Well, I can't get this story that you shared with me out of my head. And it was about someone who waited. they were talking about refinancing their home, and the rates had already started dropping. And I think you were going to save them, and I may have the numbers wrong, but it was like $600 a month. And they said, no, we're going to wait till it's $700 a month, something of that nature. And they just waited, and then the rates went up. I just can't get that out of my head, of this whole idea of waiting cannot be your best option.
Waiting is almost never a good option. It's a fool's game. And you're right. It was a refi customer last September, when the 10-year bond yield dipped to 3.6. They had closed a new construction purchase the year before at 7.5.
Oh.
And I started talking to them in like May, June of last year. Hey, you got a great opportunity to refi, because even then we were in the very low sixes. And they were adamant about, and I had a phone call with them, conference call, and spent an hour on the phone. We want to refi when we can save $700 a month. Well, at the time I could save them $450. They didn't want to do it. Then as we got closer into the summer and approaching September, then I was to the point where I could save them $540. No, want a $700. In early September, right before the Fed decision to lower the Fed funds rate by 0.5%, where the bond yield had been approaching 3.6, I was able to offer them below 6 on the rate. Again, they were at 7.5, and I couldn't get to 700 quite yet. I could save them 630.
Oh,
they said no. I want 700. Well, we all know what happened after June, after the Fed announcement of 0.5%. Bond yields have gone up ever since. They lost the opportunity. Wow,
that's tragic. That's tragic. Well, Art, as always, you're a wealth of knowledge, and this is just, as I said, this was a truth session of, if you're a homeowner, it could require some sacrifices. Yeah, it might be the point where Art tells you, hey, this all works if you get rid of that $900 car payment, whether it's a big, beautiful truck or it's a big, beautiful car. But that's what it sometimes takes. And you know what? I guarantee, I can't say I guarantee you, I know as a homeowner who's had to go through this, the wait is worth it. And the sacrifice, having people over for dinner and barbecuing versus going out and expending money at a restaurant, that's always funner anyway, because you know what? I can wear my flip-flops and jump in the pool. Enjoy it. Art, I have your information on there. Your cell phone is on there as well, but your office, 760-969-5023. Make sure to give Art a call. And as always, Art, thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Take care. Well, thank you, everyone, for watching and listening to this week's Mortgage Minute. I appreciate your time and attention on this. Stay tuned for next week's edition of the Mortgage Minute. In the meantime, have a great weekend this weekend, and go Dodgers. So long. Take care.